When do you think young people who have been raised in church and in the Christian faith are most likely to walk away? Would you guess it is during the first 2 years of college, the last 2 years of college, or during high school? Stay tuned. You're going to find out as we begin a series on why kids are walking away from Christianity and what we can learn and do about it.
If your desire is to become spiritually stronger, emotionally healthier, and relationally smarter, you're at the right place. Speaker and writer Stephanie Smith inspires and equips you to achieve these three key aims. If you're a parent, you'll also learn how to raise empowered kids, ready for adulthood. Let's get started.
Welcome back. I'm delighted that you are here today. We are going to be beginning a short series on why kids are walking away from the Christian faith. What can we learn from the data? And then what can we do about this in our own lives as individuals, as educators, and also as we have an impact on young people around us, and not just young people, but on the parents who are raising them, often grandparents, and also for those who are involved in working with youth, educators, youth pastors, mentors, just across the board. This is good information that anyone that cares about the next generation and the coming generations and their faith needs to know. This is one of the talks that I give at churches, at Christian schools, at homeschool groups, or any organization that is a faith-based organization. You can find out about this and other speaking engagements that I offer on my website, stephaniepresents.com. For quite a while now, we have had books and movies and talks and presentations so that there is this idea that young people who are raised in Christian homes and in Christian families, and I don't just mean by that, I want to be very clear at the beginning. I'm not just talking about somebody who has a label of a Christian home in terms of some sort of value system, but I'm talking about kids who grow up with parents who are involved Christians, kids who are growing up in churches, primarily, not only, but oftentimes in what we might consider evangelical churches. In other words, people who take their faith seriously. And it's not just a social status to say, I'm a Christian. But we've had this notion that they have this strong faith until what? Until they get to college. And then they encounter a professor or they encounter a group of peers on the campus and they pull them away from their faith. Now, to be certain, does this happen? Absolutely, it happens. But what current data is showing us might surprise you, and it might even scare you a little bit. But we're not called to live in fear. We're called to live in awareness. And we can't tackle problems if we don't understand the true nature of the problem. At the very beginning of today's podcast, I asked the question, of the three choices, the first 2 years of college, the last 2 years of college, or during high school, when do you think kids are most likely to be walking away from their faith? And when I ask this question in talks, normally one of the answers, the dominant answer that I get is either A or B. It's during the first 2 years of college or the last 2 years of college. And people are usually very surprised when they find out, no, the answer actually is during high school. But here's what we have to understand about that data. It's not a matter that kids are announcing they have walked away from their faith. Does that happen? Absolutely, that happens. And there are plenty of parents who have a 14, 15, 16, 17, 18-year-old living in their home who has said to them, I don't want anything more to do with God. I don't want anything more to do with church. I don't want anything more to do with Christianity, with your faith. Absolutely, there are parents who are living in that world and in that season. And I in no way want to act like that is not happening or it's not a big deal. It's a huge deal, a huge stressor to be dealing with that. But that's not the only thing that is happening. And if, as parents and as people who care about the upcoming generations, if we only look for those signs, then we're not going to be tuned in to what's also going on. And that is people are quietly walking away from the faith internally. And it's not always so much born of this attitude of, I don't want anything to do with you or your God or your Christianity. It's oftentimes, it's more of an attitude of, I like you. I care about you. I like going to church. I like my youth pastor. He's kind, he's caring, he's good. There's a lot of great things about my home and my family and my parents. And that the whole Christianity thing that seems to have served you well. That's great. Good for you. You run with that. It's just not my deal. Is it a rejection of Christianity? Yes, but it's more of this soft rejection of Christianity. It's more of this relativism of, well, kind of you do you. You do you when it comes to everything else in life. You do you when it comes to faith as well. Kind of like, hey, live and let live, right? You have your faith, I'll have mine. We don't need to have a lot of conflict over this. I don't want to upset you. So I'm not going to tell you what I really think and what I really feel. Because again, I don't want to have a bunch of conflict and I don't see the need for it because you've got your way of doing things and I've got mine, and let's just get along the best we can. So we need to be mindful that it's not just the hard rejection of Christianity, that's the in your face kind that is happening. And it's not just happening the last year or so of high school. We actually see even at younger ages, even going into middle school, when kids are starting to walk away from Christianity and reject it, even if they are silent about that. And what's really sad is it's not just the kids that we might look at as being on the outliers. These aren't just the kids who are nominally involved in church, who just show up and go to church, maybe because mom and dad say you still have to, or that kind of. Oftentimes, it is the kids that we look at who are the leaders in their church youth group. They are the leaders in their Christian schools. And they are often the ones who are going along. There's a lot of value in that for them socially. There's even value in Christianity from an ethics standpoint, but it's not about true Christianity. And then the fullness of what is already in their heart doesn't often show up until college years or even a little past that. But the seeds of that have already taken root and are already growing and developing in those high school years. Now, as we go through this series, I'm going to throw a lot of data at you. And this isn't stuff I've just sat around and made up. And it's not just a casual data and research that I've come up with by interviewing a few people. This is data from a number of different books that I've read that rely on credible research, groups like the Pew Research Center, Barnett data, significant studies of tens of thousands of teenagers and young people across the United States. And many of these studies also show some of the same trends happening in other countries. Not every other country, but in many other countries, especially Western countries as well. But I don't want you to just walk away from this series with nothing but discouragement and depression. So I'm also going to share with you some hope that we have of things that we can do, because here's the thing. The Bible tells us that people perish for a lack of knowledge. What you don't know can hurt you. And so it's so much better when we have lives and eternal lives that are at stake for us to confront and be mindful of and to be aware of what's discouraging data, But it's far better to be aware of the data and then to be prepared to do something about it and to do something with it than to just absolve ourselves of the responsibility, because the pain that comes from not knowing this and from not acting is going to be a whole lot more potentially than the pain that comes from just learning the data. Okay, so let's dig in. For Gen Z, and this is roughly categorized as those kids who were born between 2000 and 2015. So right now, when this episode initially airs, we're talking about kids that are anywhere from 10 to 25 years of age. All right. Gen Z are twice as likely to identify as being an atheist as the general population. Now, when you think about the general population, it's everybody who was born before 2000. And yes, there are plenty of us who are still alive and kicking. And everybody born after 2015 in the last 10 years, if you look at that. But just looking at everybody in the population that was born before the year 2000, if you put all of those ages together, those kids born in that 15-year time period are twice as likely to identify as being an atheist. Now, one of the reasons that is significant for all of us, even if we don't have kids or grandkids that were born in that category, those years, is that Gen Z is projected to make up 33% of the world's population eventually. That is a staggering statistic. A third of the world's population is projected to be made up of those people born between 2000 and 2015. And when you have so many that lean heavily towards being an atheist, that absolutely will have an impact in a number of different ways. Other studies show that of kids who regularly attend church, these aren't the kids who just show up twice a year or whatever. These are kids who are regularly attending church, that by the age of 30, church attendance has declined by 43%. That's by age 30. And this idea that, they all start coming back to church once they're married and have kids, that was true at a certain point in time. That is no longer something that the data shows is happening. And we cannot just rely on old trends to project what's going to happen in the future, because the data does not show that. So there are three primary categories when we look at the research of why young people are walking away from Christianity and exiting the church. And I've broken those down into three main categories. That is the culture, church, and home. So let's talk about culture. Well, first of all, what we have is the scaffolding of Christian morality, ethics, and purpose is gone in our society. Now, I'm going to make a statement that might kind of irk or confuse or frustrate some of my listeners, but hear me out, all right? I'm not a huge fan of the phrase a Christian nation, because the reality is there's never been a nation where 100% of the people loved God, all right? It's just never been that. And so when we talk about a nation being Christian or not, it's like what percentage of people would have to identify and live as a Christian in order to say it's a Christian nation? I mean, I just don't think we can get into quantifying those numbers. But what I do understand is when we use that phrase to mean that policies, laws, general day-to-day practices were based on a shared morality that was grounded in Judeo-Christian ethics and values and beliefs. Well, that I understand, but there's a very big distinction between what we mean by those two phrases. And much of the founding of the United States, I'm not going to say all of it, but much of the founding of the United States was based on the ethics, the framework, the scaffolding of Christian morality and purpose. Now, all of the United States was not founded on that. If you go back to history, there were plenty of people who came and founded colonies here because of greed. I mean, their whole goal here was to come and to find all the gold that they thought was just kind of laying around for the taking. And I think it's interesting if you kind of track the differences in those areas that really were colonized because of pursuit of wealth and what happened with those geographical areas contrast very much to those geographical areas that were founded on the basis of a desire for religious and personal freedom and liberty. But that's kind of an aside. That's a rabbit trail. That just got thrown in for free today. You're welcome for that. Sometimes my years of teaching history just kind of pops out unexpectedly. But anyway, back to kids and the faith and Christian culture. Well, that scaffolding is gone. I mean, I think we can just all agree that that scaffolding that was there. And so you say, well, what's a scaffolding? A scaffolding is something that is put in place that provides a level of protection as something is either being built or it is being rebuilt. It's being reconstructed or it's being constructed. And then when you take that scaffolding off, because the building now can stand on its own. Well, no culture just stands on its own. I mean, every culture has some sort of scaffolding that kind of holds it together, that provides a level of protection while it's being built or rebuilt. Well, that scaffolding is gone. And so we no longer have this within the United States anyway, we no longer have kind of this universal expectation of how people are supposed to live when it comes to any aspect of life. Again, it just goes back to you do you. Whatever you want to do, as long as it's not, quote, hurting someone else, well, then that's good for you. The problem with that kind of thinking is the timeline by which we measure, well, what does hurting somebody else mean? And I've talked about this before. You know, there are laws that govern the world that we live in, the physical world. Gravity is one of those. One of the reasons that we believe in gravity is because the timeline between the action and the result is pretty short. It's not measured in years or decades or hours. It's measured in seconds. And so maybe minutes. If you jump out of a plane and you're not a prepared skydiver or parachutist, the impact of gravity is going to become real to you in a matter of seconds or minutes, depending on the height of that airplane. And one of the reasons that we believe in it is because that timeline is something that we can measure so quickly. Well, there are other laws that govern the world, and we don't experience the full measurement of those, maybe for years, decades, or even centuries. We see that a lot in our physical world as far as how we care for it. And so you can look at places like England at one time was a forested country. Many parts of the United States at one time were incredibly different geographically than they are now with their natural resources. Well, what happened? People came in, they decimated the forest or the prairies or whatever, and then the full impact of that doesn't show up for years, decades, or maybe even centuries later. And then we go, oops, might have not been a smart thing to have plowed up all those prairies or to have cut down all those trees. Well, in the same way that we have laws like that in the natural physical world, we also have moral laws. And just because we don't always get to measure the impact of something in a very short window of time doesn't make the law invalid. And so one of the problems with this whole you do you, as long as you're not hurting anybody, is that sometimes hurt doesn't show up immediately in the person. It shows up in the impact that it has throughout their life and as it spreads throughout the culture. And that might not be measured until another generation or two down the road. And that again is one of the reasons that God tells us to look back. I mean, history is not just important because I happen to like it personally. God places a premium on knowing our past and our history because he wants us to learn from it and to not repeat the mistakes of the past. So how does this scaffolding of Christian morality, ethics, and purpose, the absence of it, how does it show up in a very tangible way? Well, for example, going back to Gen Z, one of the significant studies said that these are people who would say that happiness is defined by financial success, and 49% of Gen Z said, absolutely, financial success is what defines your happiness. 34%, so 1 in 3 said, lying is morally wrong. That means 2 out of 3 said, no, lying is not something that is morally wrong. Now let that soak in for a minute. Lying is not something that we look down on just in Christianity and, oh, it's great and it's fine in every other world religion or major belief system. Lying has pretty much been understood universally around the globe to not be a good thing. Now, certainly there are nuances to that. But as a whole people group, we have never come to the place of saying, you know what, lying is just fine. It's no big deal. You just do, whatever. Now, to be certain, there's always been like, well, lying is okay in this context and with these people. We can lie to our enemies. We just don't lie to those around us. But we're not even looking at that kind of distinction. It's a pretty sobering thing when we look at and say what could end up being a third of the world's population would say, only a third of them that would say, yeah, lying is something that is morally wrong. When we look at a lot of the other aspects of what has traditionally been defined as morals and ethics, and we see that those are being replaced, they're being rejected, they're being diminished. As a believer, that comes to the question of, well, who needs God when there is no sin? Because if we don't characterize behaviors and actions that have traditionally been seen, even by non-Christians, as something wrong, even if they wouldn't have called it sinful, they might have called it unethical or not good or harmful or whatever. But what God calls sin, well, if we don't really recognize the concept of sin, then why do we have any need for God or for a Savior? The reality is we don't. So these beliefs about morals and ethics and purpose and values, they have an impact in how somebody does business. They have an impact in how somebody treats other people. The expectations that I have for myself and I have for you are very different. And also then it also says, well, what's the purpose of having faith to begin with? So I have just started to touch on some of the topics as we go through this series. There's a lot more data to come. But again, I promise there's also going to be some things that you're going to be empowered with, because while the data can be discouraging, we are not called to live in fear. God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power, of love, and of a sound mind. And one of the things that we see throughout all of Scripture is that God never runs away from facts. He never tries to hide from what is. As a matter of fact, he's sometimes brutally honest about where things are, how bad they are. But he has equipped us to be able to face reality at all cost, so that through his power, we don't have to accept that. We don't have to give in to that. We can actually do something about that. So if you care about young people and their faith, then subscribe to the podcast, share this with others. And then also, again, I have a talk that I give on this. It's a very empowering talk, as well as other talks that I have for parents. You can find out about that. You can contact me on my website because, one of the values of having someone come and to physically present information to an entire group of people, whether it's parents in your community, in a Christian school, in a church. And sometimes I just encourage Christian schools and churches in the area, get together, work together to have a conference that's not just for your individual people, but for your community. Because when people have a shared vision, when they have shared knowledge, when they have shared language, then it exponentially increases the possibility of having impact. All right, my friend, that is going to wrap us up for today. Visit the website, stephaniepresents.com. Sign up for the weekly newsletter, High Impact. Remember this, you have an impact that is immeasurable, eternal, and irreplaceable. I'll see you next time.
Thank you for listening. Visit the website, stephaniepresents.com, and sign up for High Impact to join the mission of building spiritually strong, emotionally healthy, and relationally smart women and families. You can also book Stephanie to speak at your event and check out additional resources. Together, we can invite and equip generations to engage fully in God's grand story.